It's taking one more second to load in, so just 1 second.
But they don't need to hear that anyway.
With potentials.
It is still in the recording, so, you know.
Oh.
How long is our break?
It is now over. Feel free to continue.
So members, I'm happy to open this up for it to be more of a discussion. That felt very structured. Or if we're feeling as though we've kind of covered this topic, I'm happy to try to move ahead and see if we can fit in a committee report. And that way we might be able to get through parts of our meeting quicker. Do we want to engage on this topic more? So it seems like folk are wanting to continue the discussion, which is great. So I'm going to just say, and we're going to try this out for the next 10, 15 minutes, just jump in an orderly way so that we don't have to have a super structured conversation.
Well, I'm gonna jump in because I can't figure out how to, my Zoom is doing something strange and I can't figure out how to raise my hand. I think that my question is, what is as a new member, what is our role in this process? Like, where can we be constructive? I think some of the things Representative Chang laid out are important as far as making sure people understand, like, what does the letter mean, in that it is not automatically that park is canceled. That sounds like one place, but also B, like, they have not yet applied. They'll be applying soon, outside of waiting and hoping for what I hesitate to call the best in a pandemic. What are we supposed to be doing, either in coordination with OSSI or as far as outreach to the public? Like, what is helpful?
I think it's, I mean, the folks have already said what they really wanted for Plan A. I feel like OSSI has responded with the waiver. It seems like an impending, we need to start working on getting public engaged around if we have to test the Plan B factor that Dr. Sutter was talking about. Because I feel like if we can start doing this now, it helps with some of the stress and rush that's going to come with the Department of Ed kicking it back, and then we'd be back in like an uproar around testing. So I feel like if FSS members, I know me right now, my personal homework is to read what the guidance from U.S. Department of Education was, and then try to start engaging Ward 8 folks around what could possibly happen if it gets kicked back, so we can start getting some ideas. It may even be worth getting it, I'm not sure, on an agenda for a working session or something to kind of prevent the possible backlash.
I'll throw out one other thing. I thought it was interesting in Darren's report on New York that it noted that New York has now posted its next proposed waiver, and it's up for public comment. And I understand that is, according to the Ed guidance, that is also still the requirement for us, that the waiver is published and public comment is put up. But I know OSSI in their announcement to LEAs said they would be working with the department to get a waiver, and there was no mention of public comment. So I think if we could get clarity around when it is expected that the public would be able to comment, that would be helpful, so that folks are ready to go and that they know where to direct their comment at the time. Because I do think, like, us providing clarity to our constituents is a huge benefit we can add to this process in clarifying misinformation and helping amplify timelines and processes.
It is my understanding, Representative Sutter, based on conversation with OSSI, that public comment is still part of the process, and that this request is being made in two phases. First, I would call a soft request to see, like, what's the likelihood that such a request might be approved before formally making the request. I think we're still in that first phase. And so when if OSSI were to then formally request, then that's when the public comment phase would trigger. To your point, though, there's already been communication to the public, and to what's already been said. I think there is a need for there to be clarity around where we are in the process, and I'm sure Asi will update members of the public soon. So,
okay, I'm jumping in. Is that right? So I just want to say I agree insofar as we can offer clarity to a waiver has been applied for. We may not get it. We probably won't get it. That's a plus. I would caution against overly trying to create engagement around this. I mean, I feel like people are asked to engage all the time. And as we all know, so much of what they engage on, whatever they say, that's not what happens. And this is maybe even more so than some of our local situations. The waiver isn't going to depend on that local input. I can't imagine it. Somebody can tell me I'm crazy. So I think clarity is important. I would worry about overly telling people this is what they should be engaged on, since there's so much that people are engaged in right now.
Yeah, I don't think our goal, so yes, engagement is not what is going to impact what the department decides. Absolutely true. That being said, people understanding and being clear on what's actually happening,
Clarity.
always super important. Period. That being said, some of the things we've heard in addition to, as far as the why this is problematic this year, like I saw John Paul put in the chat as far as some of the flexibilities. So like the testing window, lifting that up as a response, like given we could likely be denied, not having an 8-week testing window, which was floated, matters a bunch. Like the public weighing in and saying like, hey, like this is impacting our instructional time. This is a lost opportunity, matters, right? Or thinking about what are like when we do the window matters completely. Because if educators could use, I don't know, time now to be thinking about like data they'll actually get back soon enough to inform instruction. And then like I saw Representative Patterson suggest that maybe we move the window for Park to the spring, like thinking about like what is helpful to people now and how do we get on the right track for informing what we'll do in schools. I think engagement can actually be super helpful and super practical around that. So for that reason, I would push and appreciate public engagement. Yeah, so I'll stop there because I jumped in before and I know other people probably want to jump in as well.
As a teacher who went through Park testing and then when I was teaching seniors, I didn't have to worry about it as far as that was concerned, but I did have to worry about my coworkers and the stress that they were under in trying to prepare students for the Park test. I can't imagine what will happen this year if the students, I don't know the people you've been talking to, but the people I've been talking to, the attendance in a lot of the classes is negligible at best. And the results of a Park test this year would be less than abysmal in a lot of the schools. It wouldn't be any judge of anything at all.
Yeah, I'd like to add on, from my own experience, I remember there was a point when I was in middle school when most students in my grade, like, you know, no one really thought the Park mattered. And those were under normal circumstances. It was just for us particularly, being a charter school, and in some ways the Park having less weight on some of our teachers and the students ourselves. We didn't really take it seriously. And when that happens, when you get an essay question, you just write whatever you feel like, you don't answer the question, you get a bad grade on the essay. Then that skews your entire essay score. Or if there's a long math question you're at home and you'd rather be, I mean, I don't know what middle school kids do, but you'd rather be doing anything else. Maybe you have a pet, maybe you just want to be with your dog. So you don't even attempt the long math question where you have to type out your response for the answer and explain how you get to your word. Like, this isn't a regular, it's not just multiple choice. Unless they're somehow changing the test, it's not just multiple choice. It's not like just 2 + 2. A lot of it are conceptual. A lot of these problems are conceptual problems that make you think. And I mean, I think any of us could ask teachers in middle school, like, how well are your students doing at home with like being in these situations where they have to really use a lot of energy and brain power to figure out some of these problems. We won't get anyone who tries, in my opinion. We'll get a large percentage of students who get scores that make absolutely no sense. And then we'll look at the data. And then by the end of it, we'll say, well, this data never mattered in the first place because not enough students tried. I think that's what will likely end up happening. And for that reason, no matter what happens, we're almost not even going to like see these results of the park as reliable or credible. And we're not going to take it seriously. So if we're dedicating, and I think it was, I'm not sure who said it. I think it was Representative Reed about how this would take 6 to 8 weeks. Like, that's invaluable time. And 6 to 8 weeks to worry about a test for a school, or 6 to 8 fewer weeks that you could be teaching content that students actually want to learn, because studying to a test is not fun. I don't think it would be smart to take the park exam this year. And it wouldn't be useful whatsoever. We know students aren't learning at the rates we want them to be. But I think, like Representative Leary said, that's not the most important issue, because the students can pick that up. Once students can go back in person, it will be possible for students to make up what they've missed. But like the standardized test, having information that may or may not be reliable, may or may not be accurate, won't really do much. I still think the most pressing need, especially for middle schoolers and elementary schoolers, should be their mental health. And I would rather see a test on students' mental health happening during this period, and not anything in terms of what they know with English and math and science. But that's just my opinion. I think if we want to test anything, let's see how our students are doing mentally, and see how many of them are going through like serious mental illnesses, or how many of them have developed some sort of mental condition, or how many of them are currently like having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, how many of them don't want to learn. I think that's what we should be measuring right now, because I mean, if there is a will to learn, students can learn. But if we don't even know if students want to learn, if they even want to go to school, and then I mean, I don't know. I think, as Representative Gasoy just said, priorities. I think that's the #1 priority. I'd rather have accurate data, full knowledge of how our students are doing mentally right now, than what their scores are looking like on a standardized test. Because I mean, these kids are going to have years. A lot of them will have another decade in school, maybe. But if they're not developing correctly psychologically, or they're dealing with depression from a young age, it's much harder to get them out of that if that's how they're growing up. It's not an easy fix. So I think the longer that we wait to assess those needs, the more trouble we'll be in down the road.
And I would like to jump in and kind of piggyback on what has been said. Well, Sullivan and a lot of my colleagues. My major concern, if we have to administer the test, is how do we equitably do that in a manner that really serves our families and our students. I have a very big problem and concern about how do you proctor the park in this condition, in homes that have already been underserved previously when we first had to go to distance learning. Now you're asking for parents, and I'm a parent of 2 who would be taking the park. Both of my children will be taking it. I have leaned heavily on my wife to help with our children and their school during this time, while she's allowed me to do my job and be on the State Board of Education, and to then ask my wife and turn around and say, okay, let's get prepared for the park. And that's real when you're a family with 2 children or even more who would be taking this test. And we're individuals who have all the things that can get all the things for our children to be prepared and get those things done. But I think about a whole bunch of families that I represent and who I live with and who are my neighbors, who this would be the most difficult thing in the world for them to get their children ready to take the park. And speaking with some of my colleagues at my job and how they would have to get students prepared, I just don't, at this time, I can't wrap my brain around it. After talking to them, every conversation that I've had, whether it's been a parent or an educator, or even my daughter, who is also an educator in 4th grade or 4th graders, they can't even wrap their minds around what this is going to look like. It's almost a fear that if they have to administer this test, what does this look like? At what expense does it come? It's really, for anybody who just says, we're not going to approve your waiver, have them go and speak to an educator or a parent at this particular time. And if that does not change your mind or look at this differently, then you have to be almost inhumane to what people have literally went through during this pandemic. And so I'm very concerned about equity in this. If we move forward with this, how does that look? How do we actually administer it? When we administer it, if we're going to administer it, there's just so many questions where not administering it is, to me, is the best solution.
I just want to insert something I talked about. I teach graduate students, many of whom are current teachers, and we talked about this situation of testing. And one thing we talked about in class that feels like is coming up now is that we have a lot of associations with these tests. Teachers are accustomed to having them used for evaluative purposes in the impact system. Schools are used to seeing them as part of the accountability system. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety and fear and anticipation that carries over from those systems. This is a year when none of that happens. So one of the things I hope we keep in mind is that the logistical things are real. The issues about administration and equity are all real. But I also think we've got to remind folks that they're the stakes. And I will say, if the stakes are true for impact, I think that's wrong. Like, I don't think these tests should be allowed to be used for anything this year, except for giving us a sample sense of what is happening with the students who take them. So I do think that's something I hope we can reiterate, that if these assessments have to be given, that we give them in the way that is least obtrusive. Feels like fall might be right for that. That we do our best to take advantage of all the flexibilities afforded by the Department of Ed. We shorten the tests, or we use a sampling system so that students are testing for a shorter period of time, and that we make sure that folks are clear that the usual pressure they feel to get kids ready should go away, because you're not getting kids ready for anything that is being counted. You are giving the kids the assessment, making sure that they know what they need to do, and then letting them do it. And I do think that that is something that's going to be very hard for folks to make the mental shift, but another thing I hope we can be part of communicating.
Can I?
You all.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I have 2 thoughts. So one is like, yes, I agree with everything that Representative Patterson and O'Sullivan laid out about just humanity right now. Absolutely. And I guess to build on and possibly even take a different direction than Representative Sutter's point. No, we shouldn't have all of the high stakes things for schools and for districts applied this year. Yes, that I would say that's also a certain level of just humanity and decency. Yes, also there, to Representative O'Sullivan's point, there's a question of if it will be good data anyway. Because sometimes bad data is worse than no data. That being said, there has been an outstanding question in any year around the value proposition of assessments for families. And if we believe that families are really like stewards of their children's education, when we think about not just this year, but years in the future, there should be some type of value proposition for families around these tests. We've made cases around like accountability for school districts, accountability for teachers and their and like bonuses. We have not at all said to families like, hey, like this is a tool you can use to understand like where your kid is, what they've learned, where they might need some help. Like it doesn't mean anything to them, and it doesn't mean anything to their students. And so as we start to think about what do we do, not just this year, but in years out, that should actually be part of our equation. Because one of the things that I've heard a lot of people talk about with regard to arguments for why we should be testing right now is you want to have some accountability of the system for students who have traditionally not been well served. I would argue that could only actually be true if people can actually use the information they have to hold somebody accountable. And so whatever we do in the future, there has to be some value proposition and something meaningful, not just for teachers and for district leaders and for principals, but for actually families and for kids who are putting in all of their time taking these assessments. So that would be my parting thought. But no one has actually made that argument or made that real for people yet.
Thank you. With that, we are going to close this discussion. I would just note that Vice President Gasoy and I are meeting with ASI next week ahead of our next public meeting, and we will ask them to explicitly address the concerns that were raised here tonight and talk about what is Plan B or C or D and all of the matters that you raised. And with that, and I'm seeing him join the meeting now, we invited DCPS Chancellor Louis Farabee to tonight's meeting to share his plans and thoughts for Q4 and vision for what learning and assessment of learning will look like this spring, but going into next year. Dr. Farabee, I'm thrilled to have you join us tonight and welcome you to our working session. We are going to start with a brief opening statement from you, and then we'll do a single round of questions from members. And members, we will follow the same process that we did before, starting with students, and then we'll go in reverse order in terms of our questions. Members will have 3 minutes for their questions of the Chancellor. So with that, Chancellor Farabee, I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Parker. It's a pleasure to be with you to share a little bit about where we are in our planning. So we're currently in term 3, as you may know, and term 3 will take us up right to spring break. And then after spring break on April 19th, we will begin term 4 this current school year. As we look at term 3, our expectation is we will maintain our current operations and structures for most students and families, which includes the current offerings that we have for in-person learning or for in-person programming. We do have schools where there's various capacity for in-person opportunities based on the staffing model for that school, their reopening plan, and needs for students and families. We do see schools where there is more demand for in-person programming than there are seats available. So we're asking schools to present to us proposals for expanding in-person opportunities where there is more demand and capacity. We will be reviewing those plans throughout the month of March, and then we'll be collaborating with schools on expanding in-person programming as we can throughout term 4. So that is where we are as it relates to our current posture and potential more in-person programming. We recently released budgets to schools. So our local school advisory teams are currently working through their budget for the 21-22 school year. We are asking schools to plan with in mind our normal operations for in-person learning for students and families. And if we need to pivot to another structure, we will do so, but we're asking plans to be developed with in-person learning for all students in mind. We've also distributed to schools a supplemental budget for acceleration. Those dollars are based on the number of at-risk students in their buildings. Also is based on the level that students are in. So we've seen more struggles with remote learning for our elementary age students. So we've given more weight to our elementary schools in their allocation for this supplemental amount. It can be used for in-person programming and remote programming, primarily in person though, however, and it can be utilized for social emotional development. So as part of our current stimulus 2 funds of ESSER 2, we've allocated $33 million towards our acceleration efforts, and 26 million of that is allocated directly to school budgets. We also have another 27 million that is allocated to technology to provide devices for students, and allows us to realize our goal that we set for ourselves to have one-to-one devices for students in grades 3 through 12 and 1-to-3 ratio for students in grades pre-K through 2nd grade. This also allows us to refresh devices for teachers and WTU members who have devices that are out of life cycle. It also allows us to expand the tech support for students and families and staff. We also have set aside $9 million for innovations and also outdoor learning structures to support schools that are interested in expanding their in-person programming through the use of outdoor spaces. And then we continue to launch new programming. We have launched a new early childhood education center at the Military Road site. And then we'll go into our 2nd year of the early childhood education site at the Stevens program as well. So we're excited that we're supporting our youngest learners through our high school students. We'll be providing summer programming as we always do, beginning in July for those students receiving special education services, language learners, and then our early literacy programming. We're also adding pre-K to the mix this summer in our centralized programming, along with secondary course recovery and enrichment. In the school-based programming, schools will be working on now with their recovery core teams, which is very similar to our reopening community core teams, where schools plan with a diverse group of stakeholders to develop plans for supporting their school community based on that local context. So those plans are underway, and the centralized programming will be announced this month. Schools will also finalize their plans this month, and then registration for summer programming will begin the first week of April. Some of the programming will extend into August, especially for our bridge programming and those programs for our secondary students. We are also asking schools to begin to think about what their acceleration activities will be throughout next school year. And then we're also beginning to plan for how we might utilize additional stimulus dollars as national discussion in Congress is working through an additional 3rd stimulus package that includes funding for K-12. So I'll stop there and give some time for Q&A on any of the topics that I've just addressed. I will close with vaccinations. I know that's an important topic nationally and where we are in schools. We made available the vaccinations to all of our staff members and partners and IC bus drivers that are working in person. We had a mass vaccination effort at Dunbar High School, thanks to our collaboration and partnership with Children's National Hospital and DC Health, and was able to administer approximately 3,000 doses to staff and partners, and then also doses to public charter school staff members as well. We're currently in a posture of having individuals sign up on a weekly basis for a vaccine that did not participate in the efforts at Dunbar. And then we're continuing to partner with DC Health as more doses are made available to provide more doses to staff members that are interested in working in person. And again, if we get even more doses, the next phase would be offering the vaccine to all of our employees.
Thank you for addressing that, Chancellor. We are going to start with Student Rep Dale.
And I also just want to shout out Shayla. She was on our Chancellor's Advisory Board for students. So she's a familiar face, and good to see you again.
Yes, it's so nice to see you. I was just about to do the same thing, but there was a lot covered, so. But the one question that I was able to focus in on with all that was covered was, I know that you mentioned that there will be multiple personalized plans and structures for different schools in regards to in-person learning and the things that they need. While I appreciate this, because we do need more voices with the people that are on ground and actually working in these classrooms to decide what is going on within these classrooms. The only question and concern that poses me is that as they develop these different structures, at what point do we become a unit as DCPS? Because going on, I understand that DCPS will continue with policies that will pertain to every school. So how are we managing that? And if you need further explanation as to what my question was, I can provide that as well.
No, I think I got the concept and the essence of your question, and just a reminder again of your thoughtful questions and input that you often provide to us. And so I think the unit of DCPS will remain strong and consistent through our universal services. So we're using a multi-tier support system to help identify opportunities for students based on the various needs that they bring to the table. So there always will be universal, what we call tier 1 services that are available to everybody. And those will be provided centrally for all students across DCPS. It's where tier 2 and tier 3 services come where there is greater diversity and strategy, and also greater flexibility at the school level. Because in tier 2 and tier 3, we're really looking to support students who need more intensive support. And then our tier 3 is the highest intensity support. So we've given students guidelines on how to support students in tier 2 and tier 3. So for tier 3, we're asking that those students have access to high dose tutoring that is either 1-to-1 or up to 1-to-3. And then for our students that are in tier 2, we're asking schools to implement strategies, what we call acceleration academies, which would be approximately a ratio of 7-to-1 up to 10-to-1. So we move from small group to 1-to-1 in those strategies, and we provide guardrails to schools and how they can plan to utilize those resources. So we will continue to monitor that, but the unit of DCPS is provided through our universal services.
Okay, and then I only have 1 more minute. So the next question that I had was with all the different variety based on the needs of these schools, and I understand what you were saying about tier 1 and tier 2 support. Are these methods by these schools, the strategies that they're using, being recorded and considered for what is working and what is not working for DCPS within itself, so that we may implement it into other schools?
Yeah, certainly. So we definitely learned a lot from term 3 that will continue to form our strategy ahead, and we continue to curate best practices for schools. We give them options to choose from and models to select from that we've vetted and evaluated. And that process will continue, but ultimately schools are also responsible for producing improved outcomes for students. And it's something that we'll hold them accountable to and continue to measure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, good to see you.
Representative O'Sullivan.
Thank you, President Parker. And it's good to see you, Chancellor Farabee. So my first question is along similar lines to Shayla's. Well, first, you agree that it's probably likely that next year we'll be going to school in some sort of hybrid model, DCPS students?
I don't believe that the hybrid model is the planned model of what we should plan for. I believe that we should plan for full operations. And then if we can't achieve that, then to dial back and peel back into other models that would support students. But our default for planning is all of our students in person.
Okay, so in the case that like we can't get all the students in person, we were in kind of a similar situation last year. And my question is like, what's your plan to engage students to like work on improving distance learning if it does happen in some capacity next year? Like, what's DCPS's plan to hear from students on their recommendations and suggestions for change?
Yeah, we continue to rely on our focus groups, our surveys, and just anecdotal feedback we receive from students. So for example, we just held a virtual learning conference with our school leaders and our teacher leaders. And one of the most, I think, memorable experiences from that conference was we had a student focus group, and we had an opportunity to hear directly from students on what's going well and what are the opportunities for improvements. And as I mentioned earlier, my student advisory, teacher advisory, and parent advisory boards that I meet with on a monthly basis also give me solid and strong feedback of what's working well and opportunities for improvement. So we'll definitely continue to seek feedback. I think one of the things that I will call out that we heard from students, particularly at the secondary level, is there's some high school students who said that virtual learning is working for them. And they prefer to continue with that for next school year. So it's definitely given us something to think about of how we might be responsive to that request.
Okay, thank you. If I could recommend that you take a listen, or if you could watch the Student Advisory Committee's town hall we held last month, I think you could learn like a lot about what some students like think needs to change going forward for distance learning. And my last question is like, what is DCPS's plan to assess the state of students' mental health right now, and going forward, what's the plan to address it as well? And I like numbers, so like specifically, will there be data and statistics on like students' mental issues?
Yeah, so because of confidentiality, we don't collect specific data point on mental health challenges that students may exhibit or share with us. I think it's a very sensitive subject, but it's something that we do track in the number of hours that we provide to students and the number of clinicians that we have on staff to support students, and then who's taking advantage of those services. And what's fascinating is we've seen a huge uptick in the number of parents and guardians who are taking advantage of these services. So it's given some insight that not only are our students in need of these services, our parents and guardians are asking for help as well. How we will continue to support students, as I mentioned earlier, we've set aside dollars in the budget for schools to establish supports for mental health and social emotional well-being. And what we heard directly from students that we've talked with is they want opportunities just to connect with their peers and their teachers in person. So I think a lot of schools are thinking about clubs, extracurriculars that they could host over the spring and the summer to address some of those issues that students are experiencing. And then I'll close with, we always have a hotline where young people can talk to a trusted adult any time of the day. And so we want our students to know that they're not alone. And if they ever need to talk to somebody, we have somebody available that can speak to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Reed.
Good evening, Chancellor Farabee. So I have two questions. I'll try to stick into my time frame. The first is around stability, and that would be in two components. How self-contained classroom programming is selected for schools. I'm getting feedback that there are going to be some shifting in programs, and given kind of the numbers about what students are showing up to school, and data around who needs just different learning experiences. It seems like there's a shift in self-contained classroom offerings. The other piece about the stability is how can we get some more assurances around the constant churn of principals. I believe Ward 8 or maybe Ward 7 might be competing in this statistic that shouldn't be a good one around the highest number of principal turnovers in the last 5 years. So I'll start with there.
Yeah, so with our self-contained classroom that serves students who have IEPs, their IEPs drive whether services are going to be offered. So year over year, the population for a school will shift based on the IEPs for the students in that building. Sometimes that warrants a self-contained classroom at that school, or if there is a cluster of students in a geographic area, we try to provide the services as closest to students as possible to ensure that they're in the least restrictive environment. As students transition each year from one school to the next, sometimes that population change and then the school programs also change. So that is a moving target year over year. So unfortunately, we can't guarantee that, for example, an autism self-contained classroom will remain at a select school year over year. Because that population may change and there may be additional students or there may be geographical considerations that would move a classroom. For principal stability, we have much engagement and conversation with our bargaining unit for our school leaders, the CSO, and a huge request from them was to explore multi-year appointments for principals to have a strong sense of security in their work. And we happily worked on a plan to secure that for principals. So our principals are now in a multi-year appointment. They've raised the fact that they felt that in many cases, they felt their jobs might have been in risk or there was a tendency not to make tough decisions because they felt like once a community called for a principal to be removed, he or she would lose their role. So we hope that this sense of stability in these multi-year appointments will bolster stability across schools, but we also know that we need to continue to ensure that we have the strongest talent in our buildings that will lead to a strong tenure performance in those buildings. So we have a very rigorous selection process and a panel process that we utilize for selecting our school leaders.
Thank you. That's my time. I would like you to look into the shifting between autism classrooms and behavior support classrooms between Johnson and Hart. Especially with autism, we know the consistency in buildings and just the routine. So can we explore a way to keep that influx in population from constant shifts? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Reed. Members, I'm going to ask that we stick to the time limit so that we can get to everybody's questions before the Chancellor has to leave. And Chancellor Fairby, I'm not sure if you can see the time as well, but we have a timer there to help us just stay within our time frame.
I can't see the timer, but I'll try to speak with as much brevity as possible, but I also want to try to respond to the questions as clearly as I can.
Absolutely, we appreciate it. Representative Thompson.
I feel targeted by that timer, but it's okay.
I can see it now.
Okay, I'm gonna make 2 comments and then I'm gonna tell you what my questions are. My first comment is I'm troubled to hear that we're not exploring some type of hybrid model, because what I understand it to be, at least when I was on the Mayor's Reopening Committee, was that it would be a health decision first. And so I totally understand your perspective as someone who cares about academics, but I also don't want us to be caught flat-footed. That's my first comment. My second comment is I'm really concerned about school budgets this year. I do sit on Woodson's LSAT. As I understand it, they saw a decrease of 18 students in enrollment, but then they got hit with a 1.2 million cut. They got $900,000 in stabilization funds, which left them with a $300,000 cut. So that's something I'll be following up with offline, but I want to make sure it's on your radar. Here are my questions. My first question, I'm curious about the in-person seats. You said that there was more demand And as you're seeing more demand, you want to make more seats available. I'm curious to know what the how we're applying the equity lens we started out with around the allocation of those seats, because demand and equity are not necessarily synonyms. That's my first question. And then my second question is, I'm hearing a lot about high dosage tutoring, which is definitely a learning acceleration tool, but I'm not hearing as much specificity around SEL approaches, and would appreciate some insight to what those approaches are for DCPS.
Yes, so I want to go back to your comment about the default planning for in-person learning. You're absolutely right. The health conditions always will dictate our operations. However, we didn't believe that it was in our best interest to plan for hybrid and then offer full in-person. We believe if we plan for full in-person, if we have to shift to hybrid, is one area that we have experience with and an easier shift to make, especially from a staffing perspective. As it relates to equity with in-person learning offerings, we believe that schools should have as many seats as possible to support students and families that have interest. We have some schools that are not at their capacity, but we do have some schools that are at their capacity and there's additional demand. And that's where we are giving schools the flexibility to offer more seats for term 4. Your note about Woodson is noted. I don't have a lot of time to talk about SEL. I would say that the world of SEL is a wide spectrum, and there isn't like a 1 or 2 strategies that I can point to that are superior to others. But when it comes to acceleration learning, we know that the high dose tutoring is a superior strategy to others. So that's why we focused in there. But I wouldn't want to limit schools to 1, 2, 3, or a handful of approaches for SEL, because I think there's a wide range of strategies that could be deployed.
Thank you, Chancellor. Representative Sutter.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us tonight, Dr. Farabee. It's nice to see you. I have 2 questions. The first is about the return to in-person learning, whether now in term 4 or in the fall. There are several schools, a few were in Ward 6, but there are others throughout the city that will not have the physical capacity in the building to have 100% of their students back in person while current distancing requirements are in place. Can you talk about what planning is happening with schools in that situation for a full in-person return? And then my second question is about online learning and the continuation of online learning for the fall. It feels like these individualized plans are working pretty well for school buildings as folks think about in-person, but less well to balancing online learning needs, since that seems uneven across campuses. For instance, there are a few schools I know of in Ward 6 that have had whole grades that have had to remain online because of teacher working conditions, where a grade level, for instance, of kindergarten teachers cannot return to the building. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about online learning for the fall to make sure that we don't have a situation where, say, an entire class of kindergartners in one school building or an entire class of 4th graders in another building is not in the building because of the distribution of teacher assignments.
Yes, so for in-person programming, I don't anticipate we'll have the capability of having full in-person learning this school year unless the guidance from DC Health is modified, because just the sheer number and the ratio and the need to cohort students based on their standards. What I do see though is schools can expand their capacity to serve more students. They can do that by utilizing outdoor space. They can utilize that staff differently to offer more seats. So I anticipate they have the ability to expand where they are, but in terms of offering a seat to everyone would be challenging in a 4.5, 5-day week model. Some schools have used cohorting in A groups and B groups. That allows you to serve more students, but students ultimately have less days in person. So I think it depends on the focus for that school. Some schools have leaned towards serving more students in less days, and some schools have leaned towards less days with less students. We'll just have to see how that plays out in their planning. In terms of next school year, we have done some scenario planning where, depending upon what the health guidance is, where we could have some centralized remote learning, or we could have remote learning that is offered at each school or in clusters. So it will ultimately depend on the number of students that we would be serving that would dictate the type of remote learning model that we will offer.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear about that planning. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Representative O'Leary.
Good evening. I have 3 questions. The first is, what is the time frame for the beginning of sports in the spring? The second question is, if the park waiver is rejected, what is the plan for assessment for this school year? And the third question is, can you explain the credit recovery program for high school students who failed courses in the first semester?
Yes, so with your first question with sports, we are told that the earliest we would know would be potentially mid-March, whether or not DC Health will modify the standards for offering athletics, DCPS. So the health conditions dictate that, and we will get our guidance from DC Health. If we're able to offer sports in the spring, we'll communicate to athletic directors and to schools accordingly when they can begin and resume operations. As it relates to, I believe your second question was around park. Park, if it's rejected in terms of the waiver from the Office of State Superintendent of Education, they would have to implement a plan based on the guidance that they receive from the U.S. Department of Ed. So I don't want to project or assume what that plan would be. I do know that the plan prior to the submission of the waiver was to offer both a online model of park and an in-person form of the assessment as well. If the waiver is approved, I can say that we will be utilizing our district-wide summative and formative assessments to monitor progress. I believe you had one other question. What was the third one?
The third question is about credit recovery for high school students.
Yeah, credit recovery is happening right now. So we have options available to students where they can participate in our Twilight programs or school-based recovery efforts. And then over the summer, we will also offer credit recovery opportunities to students as well.
Okay, the reason I said high school students, I was really thinking about seniors, and I only have 30 seconds, but about seniors who failed courses in the first semester. What can they do?
They can participate in credit recovery right now. For those seniors that may have missed a course or had a course failure from the first semester, and then whatever they're not able to accomplish over the spring in term 2 and term 3, 4, they can then take courses over the summer as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With minutes or seconds to spare, Representative Wattenberg.
Hi, thank you for being here, Chancellor. I want to make 2 question comments. One is on vaccinations and one is on next year. So I listened carefully to what you were saying about the vaccinations, and I want to push back in this way. There are staff that are ready to go back if they can get vaccinated. As you said, part of your plan is to encourage that insofar as schools want to bring more people back, and there are staff that are ready to do it. But many of them will only want to come back if they get 2 vaccinations, and I totally understand that, given the different personal situations people have. And the way it has worked so far is, on the one hand, DC, and I'm not saying DCPS, but the mayor, sometimes in DCPS communications, say, oh, teachers who are going to teach next term are eligible. But last week, teachers were being turned down from that. And I have all sorts of emails from people with, messages from the site saying that. And this week, they were explicit. People with employment reasons for getting the vaccine were explicitly excluded. So that's 2 weeks that these teachers who hope to go back haven't been able to get the vaccines. And we're coming up on a point where they won't be able to get 2 vaccines in because one of them takes 21 days, the other takes 28 days. And it seems to me, out of respect and compassion, we should be doing everything possible to get these teachers their vaccinations completely before they go back. So that's one thing I want to just put that out there. The other is really to raise a question about next year in terms of the way you're seeing it. As I understand it from sort of medical types, is almost certainly there will still have to be some social distancing. So I get what you're saying about Plan B, but what I wonder is why we can't use some of the stimulus money, because this is its purpose, to have more staff and more space. And then we can set up as Plan A, not to have 25, 30 kids in a class, but something less, have more teachers and have space, whether that's leasing buildings or having not just tents, but pavilions. So the Wi-Fi is there so that people are comfortable going out there and it can last. Adjacent streets, libraries, community partners, et cetera. So that's really what I want to ask is, can't we prepare for that?
Yeah, I think there would be caution in my mind of assuming that every space that we think could be used as school space be utilized as school space. We've been very intentional in our health and safety enhancements to our HVAC units for better ventilation. We've been very careful with our HEPA units. So I just want to caution that this idea that you can take any space and convert it into a school space.
I agree. That's why it's about planning. But
yeah. I mean, I think we will hopefully we'll know what the third round of stimulus dollars will provide to schools and whether or not we can utilize those funds in that way. But as we thought about our priorities, having devices and the technology was critical, and providing the acceleration efforts that I described was also critical. So think of it as the priorities of the priorities. If you think about the limited resources we have, and I would think about it the same way as we talked about the vaccines, just given that we're also up against limited doses and we have other priority groups that I know the city is trying to manage as well, and that's our seniors and our individuals with pre-existing health risk factors. And so I know that they're being prioritized as our teachers, child care workers, and others are being prioritized. And I anticipate as we get more doses, we'll be able to deliver on the vaccine for more people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Chang had to leave, but he did chat a question. He asks, educators have reached out to ask for more information about how you're working to retain teachers given the challenges brought on by the pandemic.
Yeah, we're really fortunate. Yeah, we received a $30 million federal grant that allows us to dig deeper into our strategy for teacher retention and recruitment. So we're excited that we're able to offer some incentives. We're offering the ability to have some retention bonuses. We're also able to target our tier 1 schools who have struggled with achievement. So we're excited about the investments that we can make for our teachers as we think about the upcoming school year and the implementation of this grant over the next 3 years.
Awesome, thank you. And I would note that the state board's equity framework highlights that as an area of attention and importance, particularly for educators of color. So we appreciate your focus there. Representative Patterson.
Yes, I appreciate all the questions that my colleagues have asked, specifically Representative O'Leary, who specifically asked my questions, and so they've been answered. It looked as if Representative Reed had another question. I was asking her in the chat if she had another question, and I'm willing to yield my time to Representative Reed.
May I?
Yeah, he gave you time.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Patterson, for that. Chancellor Farabee, I know Florida has a virtual public school option where literally it's like the virtual version of what DCPS would be. Any considerations for when everything gets back to we want a new normal, but you know, could a possible offering be where it's, you know, we're running in person, but then there's also like a virtual DCPS?
Yeah, that's in consideration, and you know, it's something that we think about. You know, we try not to compare ourselves to Florida. I think Florida is a totally different landscape than the District of Columbia, but we do consider the value of having a centralized remote learning option versus a school-based model. And I think I mentioned that earlier. The balance of that is the school-based just allows us to tap into existing relationships, which our students and our parents have said are really important, and we've learned are very valued commodities. So we don't know if, you know, if the risk reward is there if we dismantle some of those relationships and move to a model where students are in a more centralized program, and potentially there's a hybrid approach to that. So we did see some students take courses across schools. I'm excited the fact that we did have some middle school students. Quietly, we piloted a model where middle school students could take advanced courses at high schools, which I think is something that we could see more of in the future, as I want to see more of our students take advanced courses in middle school, which allows them to take more advanced courses at the high school level. So we'll keep monitoring. I have some colleagues in Florida. I'll tell you that they're not excited about the centralized Florida model, and there's definitely some holes in it. So we will consider that and whether or not that'll be a solution for DC.
I'm happy it's being considered in some forward thinking, as I do feel like with this the current environment, there might be lifestyle changes that could get our kids more virtual and families virtual. So I appreciate the forward thinking.
Thank you.
Vice President Gasoy.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Chancellor Farabee, for being here. It's good to see you. I have several questions, and I would prefer to ask them one at a time. So if you can answer them succinctly, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my first one, I guess, is actually building on Representative Reed's a little bit. Hi, first of all, I just want to thank you for the flexibility that schools have had in term 3 has made a huge difference. And I, you know, in talking with Ward 1 school leaders, it's just clear that that has made all the difference and made it possible to do many of the things that they need to do to meet the needs of their community. And I guess I'm just, in listening to plans for next school year, I'm wondering if that is a possibility to sort of allow that kind of flexibility, you know, asking individual school communities to submit plans based on, you know, what they know their communities need. Because I'm wondering if all families are going to feel safe even in the fall coming back. And I think that school leaders have the best knowledge of that. So that's my first question, is just, is there any consideration of sort of more flexibility in the fall?
Yeah, we certainly could pivot there, but we didn't want to start there. So we didn't want to overwhelm schools and ask them to develop a plan for full in-person learning, develop a plan for hybrid learning, develop a plan for acceleration over the summer, and so on and so forth. So we landed on develop your best plan for in-person learning in your staffing, and then develop your plan for academic acceleration for the summer and the spring and next school year. So that's where we are now. I think if there's a need based on health conditions to pivot, we can. We've done that before, and we can do it again. But we didn't want schools to do too much scenario planning without a clear picture of where health conditions will be. I think if we get closer to the end of the school year and we know more about health conditions over the summer, and if, you know, we are able to meet the president's call for a vaccine for everybody who wants it by May, I think that positions us well for next school year. But if things, you know, don't materialize in that way, I think we could see a different landscape and could definitely, you know, rely on our schools. I think the ultimate big takeaway is a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach was not the best way to go forward. And we took that feedback from schools and we pivoted accordingly.
I had 5 more questions, but clearly I will not have time to ask them.
I try to answer them as quickly as I can.
Well, I wasn't succinct either, so I take responsibility too. So thank you. I'll send you an email.
Thank you. I believe I am last. And so Chancellor, again, thank you for being here tonight. I have several, and I'll ask in a similar way that Vice President Casoy did. First is around the federal funding allocation. You mentioned this in your earlier remarks. There were questions earlier this week on the Chairman Mendelson's community conversations about how DCPS is actually allocating that funding to schools. And so I heard you say, based on at-risk numbers, there was a second metric. Can you just expound on what that formula is and or how you all are dividing that pot of money?
Right. So there's a couple features I want to be clear about. So there's a minimum threshold of $50,000 because regardless of the at-risk population at a school, we knew that all students need to have access to some social emotional activities. So that's there. There's a higher weight given to elementary schools. And then we also weight the number of at-risk students in a building. For some of our larger schools that have a significant at-risk population, their budget for this is well over $500,000. For our smaller schools, the budget is obviously smaller. So the at-risk population, the level of the school, and then the floor of the SEL dollars would be the 3 features that I would point to in the formula.
That is helpful, but it sounds like all schools got at least or started with that $50,000 base.
That is correct.
Thank you. Secondly, in terms of special education, we know that students are not receiving their services, and that is not a finger wagging comment. We just know the reality. Can you speak to how DCPS is planning to do an audit, if you're planning to do an audit of which students are receiving services in order to course correct in the fall?
Yeah, so that is done through the IEP meeting and planning process. So we look at the types of services that are required in the IEP. We evaluate how those services are being provided. We also work with our related service providers to try to provide those services in the least restrictive environment. So based on those services and student outcomes, students are invited to participate in our extended year programming, which will primarily be in person over the summer to help produce better outcomes in the IEP goals. And then we also make modifications for services that will carry into the 21-22 school year. And if a student is transitioning from one school to another, there's a transition planning process to ensure that there's fidelity of implementation into the IEP as well. And then the parent and guardian is always a part of those IEP meetings to provide feedback where there's a need for services or if there's being progress made for the child.
That is my time. Thank you, Chancellor, for joining us tonight and the work that you and your team is putting in to ensure that DCPS has a strong Q4 and is set up for success in the fall. Before you leave, it is my understanding also that Matt Postgraf, whose camera is off, is transitioning. And I just want to publicly acknowledge the great resource that Matt has been to the state board, but also others, and acknowledge all of the work that you put in. And so we appreciate you, Matt. And thank you again, Chancellor, for joining us.
Yes, we certainly appreciate Matt's leadership. He's going to another space in Texas where they also do things very differently. So we wish him well in his transition and recognize his service and his relationships with the State Board of Ed and helping us ensure that you have as much information as possible on DCPS. And thank you for your questions. Very complex questions. I wish I could answer them in a shorter period of time, but they're very complex issues that we're dealing with right now. And I appreciate your leadership and your support as we think about how we move ahead. And the last thing I'll close with is, of course, we want to get back to a sense of normalcy, but we also know that the status quo wasn't good enough. And we expect not only to come back to where we were, but to come back better. And we hope to do that in collaboration with the State Board of Ed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you.
Members, we are now going to turn to a discussion around our all teacher survey. As you know, we conducted this survey to gauge and learn more about the experience of educators in DC. And we had a robust response from educators letting us know about their experiences in various school communities. And so I would like to welcome Keely Stern and Ryan Balk from Resident Education. As members know, Resident is our vendor for our survey for all district teachers that was conducted in January. I understand that Ryan and Keely have a short presentation, and then we'll have a discussion on the draft report and its findings. And so you should find that in your email for reference. So I am going to turn this over to Ryan and Keely.
Great. Well, thank you for having us, and I'm definitely looking forward to walking through some of the results for today. So main goal, we'll have a few quick slides just to give you kind of an overview to get everybody on the same page. But primarily, I want to leave the space open for questions now that you've looked through the report, talk about some of the detailed pieces you have, talk about next steps and so forth with it. So feel free to stop me at any time as we're going through. If there's particular pieces you have a question about in the meantime, but we will have a lot of time at the end as well. So we can go ahead and get started. So quick agenda for today, I want to give you an overview of the process. What did it look like to develop the survey and administer it? A basic overview of the constructs of the survey, an overview of the results of what's in the report, and then some of the key survey takeaways, and then obviously our time for questions. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first slide, just an overview of the process. So the main piece we were starting with was really wanting to make sure that we were measuring the pieces that were important to stakeholders in DC. So obviously we met with your board, who was very helpful, and lots of great collaboration. And I do want to say, I'd love to kind of, as we start, brag on your staff for a little bit too, because they were fantastic to work with in terms of responsiveness, in terms of thoughtfulness, in terms of collaboration. This really was you have an incredibly talented staff. So kudos to you for finding a great staff on that. Meeting with your board, as well as a lot of local stakeholders that we had, various sessions. That was really just to get what are we trying to measure? What are the constructs that we're trying to establish that are important to learn from teachers in DC? The second stage of that process was that we wanted to then align items for this so we can, so what we did is we tried to use a combination of existing items that were, we used a couple of existing scales, a couple of survey items. This is obviously a lot of new material, so there's not a lot of scales, existing pre-validated scales to go on. And then we also did newly created items to make sure we had good alignment with the concepts you were looking to measure. And finally, the survey was administered. We opened it. The goal was to open it before the end of the possible return to school. So that was kind of on our early time frame. We wanted to make sure that it was before that was happening, so they could still be in that frame of mind of more virtual distance learning. So we had it open from January 15th all the way through February 3rd. We got over 1,000 responses from 185 different schools, including every DCPS school within the district as well, and the majority of charter schools. So that's just a general overview of the process. Let's dive deep on the next one. Just within the survey, the constructs that we wanted to include, these were what we heard were important to your stakeholders. First of all, just the perception of teachers of their own support for teaching in this virtual environment. And that was both from a kind of a general support as well as support from their administrators. The second construct that we took a look at was thinking about their own experience. So, how successful are you feeling? What does it look like for you this year? To get more of an understanding of what it looked like to teach in this virtual setting for teachers in DC. The next one, we wanted to ask teachers about, they're on the grounds, right? So what's the firsthand look at what is their experience of what the students are going through? So we wanted to ask them questions about teacher perception of the student experience within virtual learning. Questions about, are they learning as much as last year? SEL supports and so forth with that. The next construct that was of interest was a well-rounded education. So are there other elements, science, math, the arts, science, social studies, arts, and the SEL that people wanted to spend time in? An important part of this is we want to do this. Everybody will say they want to add more time for things, right? But in schools, we know the reality is a trade-off. So we want to make sure that it was like framed into, you got to cut something, like even if it's at the expense of something like math and reading. That was a construct of interest. The next one we looked at was how people were feeling about returning to in-person instruction. So this was administered immediately before the start of March, which was when the planned return to in-person instruction was scheduled. So we want to know, what kind of supports do you need? How are you feeling about it? How comfortable are you about this? The next construct was thinking about supports for teaching. This was both in a virtual setting because a large portion of teachers were remaining in a virtual setting. So we wanted to see what supports did you need in that, and also for the supports needed for returning to in-person instruction. And the last one, we wanted to look at teacher retention scales, and just to say, okay, what are we thinking about teachers that have pre-existing, pre-validated scales? What is the environment like now in comparison to previous circumstances? We want to have some sort of comparison. So we want to really make sure we use some of those pre-existing scales. And these are obviously ones that we can use moving forward to then have longitudinal comparative data. So that gives you an overview of the topical nature of the survey. So we can go to the next one. I'll talk about an overview of the results. So what we did is we really looked at providing, okay, what did all the teachers say for every single demographic? What did the sample look like for the survey? What was the overall response and the percent of teachers that were agreeing for every single item, every single scale, and what does the sample look like? We also wanted to investigate, do we have elements of scale reliability, because some of these were newly constructed items. Those are within the appendix. I'm happy to go into more detail about the nerdy elements of survey creation for that as much as you'd like to. But what we then did is we did a deep dive analysis in the following questions. And these were ones that were specifically requested. Either they were requested or it might have been because of the sample. And so if we look at the first question, we look at how do results vary for teachers in charter schools. Charter schools were slightly underrepresented. We still had, around 300 responses or so from charter teachers, but if it was most of the characteristics of demographics were representative of DC. Charter schools, we would have liked it to have been up around, 45 to 50%. It was a little bit lower. So we want to just make sure we broke out those results separately. Similarly, if we go to the next one, for how did results vary for Black or African-American teachers? We wanted to separate those results because teachers in this group were slightly underrepresented within the sample in comparison to teachers in DC. So we want to make sure that we were able to view those results separately so we're not losing some invaluable information. The third one, this was requested specifically by the board, was just thinking about results varying by ward, which we can see that all the different items by each of the different wards. The next one was, what does comfort level look like in return to in-person instruction? Again, they were about to go back, so how are people feeling about it? And we wanted to really dive into all the different demographics that you could have. So what does this look like by teacher race, teacher gender, by teacher experience, ward, and so forth with it. So these were really, each one of these, and I want the data set that has been created from this is extremely rich. There is, a mountain of information that can really be gained from this, and it could be an entire body of research, for this. So we wanted to provide a deep dive into these that were the most pressing questions as requested. But I think it's also really important to think about what was not part of this initial report. So one of the things, we have over 1,000 responses, and we have we have open-ended questions. So if we want to go to the next bullet point, and you can go to the sub one on that, was a full qualitative analysis. I think there's a lot of information to glean from that. It's a pretty detailed to go through, and it's outlined a little bit in the report what that step would look like for that next step. All of that data is available for people to look through, and we are happy to conduct that analysis moving forward of all those open-ended questions. That's not part of the original scope for now, but and the second part is that a breakdown of every survey item by each of the demographics. I'm going to guess that you're going to ask me a lot of questions that I think are incredibly interesting, about, well, what does this question look like by this demographic and so forth. There's probably, given that we had about 10 to 12 different demographic characteristics and several subcategories within each one, and we had 60 items, the possibilities that you can imagine for that are endless. And there are a lot of great research questions that can be asked. The ones above here you see is that's where we did our deep dive in for the purpose of this analysis. Those were really the pressing issues, but there's obviously potential to do a lot more of it. There's a lot of questions you can answer. I just wanted to set expectations about what was done and then what's also possible, because there's a lot of different, kind of rabbit holes you could go down and really interesting research questions that you can answer. So having said all that, I think we can go to the next part where we'll think about what were some of the takeaways. One of the things that we noticed that popped out at us when we were looking at our analysis, one piece that stood out was really in this first bullet around teacher evaluation. This is actually, I really appreciate it. This is a question suggested by one of your board members. We had one about, whether you understand it. And one of your board members, Mr. Parker, was that you that I might have suggested that one? I can't remember, but about fair and credible on the evaluation. And that yielded actually one of our really interesting response that was pretty low. The majority teachers were not believing, only 43% were agreeing with the statement, either agree or strongly agree about the fairness and credibility of their teacher evaluation. And this had a pretty strong differentiation by sector. So we looked at this with Dcps. One of the great points that your staff member was bringing up about the variety of teacher evaluation systems that are within the district. It did vary, but it'd be interesting to see what that compares to in a normal year. As myself, my background is purely in teacher evaluation. So right up the road, I was developing the teacher evaluation system for Baltimore City Schools. So I've been in that area, and I can't say that I would have 100% even in a non-COVID year. But it is still something to pay attention to, particularly because it's talking about this year. The second part is leaving the profession. So we had about half the teachers reported they had considered leaving the profession as a result of teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to let that, I think it's a really important piece to honor the challenges that have been going to the point where dedicated teachers are really thinking about, this has been a tough year, right? There's some other metrics we look at with some of the teacher retention pieces where teachers still felt a sense of efficacy in a lot of ways, which can be a really strong predictor of actual leaving behavior. But I think this is just the acknowledgement of the challenges is really reflected in this. If we go to the next piece, SEL assessments, more than half the teachers really believe that. So we asked, how is the socio-emotional well-being of your students in comparison to last year? More than half believe that it was worse this year. Now, that in itself is both important from a policy, where do we need to address and establishing SEL as a priority for this. But one of the key pieces too is that only 40% felt they had the adequate measures to assess or measure. So, I mean, SEL is a huge topic, right? And it may not be all SEL. We need to do, from start to finish, A to Z, all SEL topics. We know it's worse, but we don't necessarily have the tools to tell where do we need to address it particularly, okay? Let's go to the next one. This was looking at the well-rounded education, one of the particular interest for the board. The majority of teachers believe that at least 20 more minutes were needed in each of those 4 different areas. And that was, remember, the key part is, everybody's going to say, a lot of people are going to say we need more of everything, right? But this was framed, even if it means less time for math and reading, because we know it's not just a simple add-on of minutes, it's a trade-off. So, and the time amount varied, whether it was, the average amount was, 26.7 minutes for science and 34.1 minutes for SEL of additional time they were looking for in a given day. Let's go to the next one, was return to in-person instruction. This is, probably not something that may be too surprising given a lot of the, pieces that have been out there about this, but 75% reported they were either uncomfortable, slightly uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable in returning to in-person teaching. This is of the 350 to 400 or so teachers that had been requested specifically to come back to in-person. This wasn't necessarily the full sample. We asked them, what's your plan? Have you been asked to return? The majority actually had not necessarily been reported they hadn't been. And again, this is a mix of DCPS and charter schools. So, but a high number of those that had been asked to return to in-person reported being uncomfortable. Two things that go along with that, that have some potential to address some of that discomfort. There were some pieces that were responded to about safety information, but two pieces, and again, this was also an item that was suggested by one of your staff members about returning, like time for mask breaks during the day. Had almost half the teachers asking for that. I can tell you as a teacher myself, and I teach full-time in a mask, and that definitely I can relate to that part as well. So providing time for masks as well as the ability to revise. So, I mean, teaching looks differently in this scenario. So you're having 40%, almost 40% of teachers asking for time to revise lessons because it's going to look different in a socially distanced classroom. Then the final one I wanted to note was the support for virtual teaching. Given that there will still be a high quantity of teachers still teaching in a virtual environment for the remainder of this year, we wanted to really see what that looked like. And one of the most requested supports was for those continuing was student engagement and student attendance. So the two parts of that, they look like more than half of the teachers were requesting support for increasing student engagement, and a similar number, but a little bit lower, we're looking at asking for how to support with increasing student attendance. And, we framed engagement in a way of, participating, attending, answering questions, those types of things, so that to give some examples of that. But that gives you an overview of just kind of the big takeaways that stood out to us. So with that, I want to make sure that you have plenty of time to be able to ask all your questions. And so I'll stop now and turn it over to you, and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ryan. And members, I do want to acknowledge we are slightly behind time. According to the clock, we have 10 minutes for questions. I suggest we extend that at least by another 10 minutes, but I did want to acknowledge that. So we are going to ask that you raise your hands to ask questions. And Mr. Hayworth, if you can just call on members as they raise hands, that would be helpful.
Maybe 10 minutes is plenty of time.
Maybe 10 minutes is plenty.
Yes, Ms. Wattenberg.
So I went through this. I love these polls. I love talking to you about doing them.
Oh yeah.
And I thought it was great. And it really, it has, as you say, it's so rich. And I went through it. I went back, I looked at your takeaways, and I thought the takeaways were so on spot. Right. The point about impact just jumped out crazy. Two things that I want to raise that you didn't quite raise, although they're in here. One is the one other issue that was huge, I thought, that you didn't capture in the takeaways was the number of people, I'm trying to find it now, who said, yes, students who I teach are screened for dyslexia during this time of virtual distance learning. And there was something else like that that was way lower than everything else that was already very bad. So I did want to call that out. And for anyone who wants to look at it, I think I've got page 36 as one, and
page 12, if you want to, it shows the actual like overall average for that. And one of the things I do want to note is that all of those questions in that category, this actually kind of highlights more of your point. They had a not available option for that, just that category. So this isn't just, kind of watered down by people that like, oh, I don't know, I'm just going to mark that they don't do it, right? It gave them the option to say, I'm not aware of the process within the school. That was an important consideration that was in the development process that we wanted to make sure. So this is people who are aware of the process and what percent are saying that it is happening right now. And so then you have the percentages laid out that Ruth correctly mentioned, noted that was really important, that was stood out below the others.
And I had one other, but I'm going to pass on now, and maybe I can come back for 20 seconds later, because there was another one that I thought was great, which I don't have right in front of me.
Thank you. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, I just wanted to mention how similar the answers were with the impact evaluation and the leaving the profession part of your survey to our teacher retention survey. Our teacher retention survey was from teachers who had left the system, but the numbers are very similar. And I would also like to mention, when you talked about student engagement, to me, from what I've heard from everyone I've talked to, is the biggest problem right now that the online learning is giving us is the lack of student engagement, is the fact that the students aren't even engaged at all. And that that's where we're going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting in the future. But I really appreciate your survey. I'm wondering if that part about the social and emotional well-being would change a little bit in another month if you surveyed the same teachers again.
Based on what factors changing?
Just based on more people being back in the building, maybe, or whatever was going on at the time.
Okay. You know, and I think what you're saying, and this is, by the way, this resonates strongly with things we're seeing in other places in the country when you talk about student engagement. I mean, there, you know, I think there's two sides to look at it, where you've got, you know, and I think the figure 2, if you want to look at it on page 13, I think speaks. So there's both a, you know, like what is my worry about the engagement? I'm struggling with getting student engagement is what we're hearing, right? You're dead on that. And at the same time, we also see a decent amount of numbers. And I'm happy to, if you're looking, I'm happy to share that figure if that's easier, whatever's, but like we're seeing the top 2 categories. We're asking, you know, what % of your students are regular engaging? And, you know, we had most teachers be in the top 2 categories, right? In the either 81 to 100% of my students are engaging, or 61 to 80% of my students are engaging. And you had some numbers that are really worrisome just from like a pure overall number. You had 48 teachers respond that 0 to 20% of their class was engaging, right? You had 111 teachers report that 21 to 40% of, so I mean, you're talking about, you know, a very small, a few kids per class,
right,
are engaging. So I think that those are, I think there's both good news in that fact that like, it's actually, there are a higher percentage of people that have a higher number of their teachers and or students engaging in class, but there are really significant numbers that have very low engagement. So it both.
I think that's a very real description of what's going on in DCPS, is that there are schools where everybody's engaged.
Yep.
And there are schools where hardly anyone is engaged.
Yep.
And it does have to do with a lot of other factors. It has to do with economics. It has to do with what part of the city they're in. And it's very important. And when we talk about equity all the time, it's very inequitable.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Members, I don't see additional hands, but I know that that Dr. Sutter does have a question and she's on the phone. So can we see if Dr. Sutter, are you available for your question? So
hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Fantastic. Sorry. Sorry about that. I'm out walking the dogs, but my question is this. The data is great. From a research perspective towards sort of policy application, what would you suggest we can do with this data based on the response rate and the way it all came out? And what would you suggest we not do with this data?
So there are a couple things that I would think about. I think that, I mean, I'm not going to necessarily tell you like what policy. I mean, there are some recommendations that we put in that have policy implications, right? And I think in particular, if some of the last three questions that were specifically asked for it, we tried to go through and say like, here's some potential recommendations. What I can tell you is that these data are representative from a variety of demographic characteristics, from a variety of teacher experience characteristics, from a variety of school types. What I do believe is that, and I really do a huge credit to the work that your staff was doing in collaboration and getting a high number of responses, but also, we were right from the beginning, we were monitoring every single, category. And then when we saw an adjustment that needed to be made, your team was incredibly responsive in helping us be able to try to address that as much as possible. I know you board members were individually reaching out to people as well. And so we appreciate that. I think that the data are representative of the perspectives of that time period for teachers within DC. So
great.
Now, what you do with that is, Jesse, we work together in Baltimore. I mean, once you get the data, yep. that doesn't tell you exactly what the policy decision is every single time.
That's right.
We can have a whole conversation about that. But what I would say is I would have confidence acting upon the data.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Sutter. Are there additional questions before Ms. Wattenberg has a second round? Great. Sorry, Ms. Thompson.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thanks. I'm interested in this response around teachers feeling like they've had helpful professional development around social emotional learning in particular. One of the things that I've heard a lot about as far as our success in being able to respond to the pandemic and recover is that we're gonna need to employ SEL approaches well. And a lot of that is not, can't be like bought and just like dropped in. We have to make sure that our educators actually, their instruction is supported and informed by SEL practices. And so I would be curious, like if there are any other trends around PL or anything that we should be paying attention to or we should be pushing for, because that for me is particularly alarming.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a strong and clear signal that was being sent that you had. I mean, if I'm looking at it's, 59% were saying they felt they had help for professional development. So if I turn that around, 40% of people feel like they haven't gotten what they needed to be able to support the emotional development, particularly, which is a different world in a virtual environment, right? And I think that's really meaningful. I would say that there's not a blunt object solution to this. And there's going to be a lot of different needs in different schools. And I just think that kind of like a broad strokes, all SEL, I just don't know if there's going to be the time to do everything. And I think that a strategic kind of surgical approach, a data informed, it's the same as the academics. We know that they've missed a lot of standards, right? And you take something like a map test or things like that, and you're going to be able to say, we can't just reteach all of second grade. We need to find out what you missed because we don't have time for that, right? We need to find out what you missed and really be strategic about those. And I think you just carry that straight over to SEL as well, where we need to not just do a year's worth of SEL in, a 2-week summer school or 4-week, whatever that looks like. We need to really say, what standards? Is it relationship building? Is it interpersonal relationships? Is it a lot of those different CASEL standards? Like, are we really thinking about it from, for each kid, it might be unique. And so I think you're really correctly noting the part of it, and people are requesting that and, kind of crying for the tools.
Thank you. Dr. Gasoy, I saw your hand. Do you want to go now or?
I did not have my hand up. I was just noting that Representative Thompson had her hand up first. So that's all.
Gotcha. Okay. So Ms. Wattenberg for a second round.
I just wondered if you could say something about how our data, how our numbers compare to what you see in other districts, other states. And I don't know how much you have done this kind of survey work in the pandemic, obviously comparing our numbers now to other people a year ago, less meaningful, but and specifically, especially on the retention issue and on the and on all the pandemic, virtual engagement, everything like that.
So there's a couple things I would say. I mean, one, we did as far as kind of overall trends, right? So from an item by item level, it's a little bit hard to say like apples to apples because we did all unique items. We took some that we drew from other surveys, but then through our collaboration process, there was a lot of changes that we made that were either, requested by board members, staff members, stakeholders, and so forth that were, I think, really productive changes that really tailored to the needs of DC. But what that does lose is a little bit of comparability. Now, I remember all those battles that we were fighting about the teacher retention questions where I was like, I know you want to change it, but this one we really need to keep the same. That's why we kept those the same, is because we really wanted that comparability. So I would say that the other thing I want to say is that this is also brand new work, right? I actually think that people haven't gotten as much. There's been one other report that I've seen that just came out in a working paper that we utilized some of the question. I think I might have shared it. I know I shared it with the staff. And I can't remember if that also went to board members, but the paper out of Brown by Matt Kraft and I spoke with him about this. And I mean, there's some people that did some work on the spring last year, and that's what their paper came out about it. But this is really new work. There are not this type of wide scale, this type of comprehensive survey that's being done right now. And I actually really encourage your board to share this potential result with others. There will be a lot of other districts that will be very interested because they haven't been able to conduct this thorough of an investigation. So this is the biggest one I've seen this year. That the closest one is at the end of last year. That's been released publicly. There's been some internal pieces and things like that. But from the retention scales, there was some comparability overall, but things that I noted, and this is in table 11, what we did is we put a comparison number in there. Now, these aren't DC teachers that are a comparison, right? We weren't able to, we don't have numbers from last year about these specific questions, but we're seeing in the ballpark, but things that stood out to me were things like, I think about quitting the teaching profession. And that relates directly to our question. We said the challenges of COVID-19 have maybe considered leaving, right? So there's some that was higher than the comparison. So we're looking at, kind of out of a scale of 9 being the strongest degree and 1 being the least, you had a higher rating, which in this case is a negative thing. If it's an intent to quit scale, a 4.45 versus the comparison of 3.28. So you're having, that's about a standard, deviation or so usually in survey work, a little bit higher. So that's a meaningful piece. And that aligns with some of the other different pieces that we were seeing. Now, the occupational commitment scales, right? So what do I think about the profession in general? Had some similarities to a lot of what we'd seen before. There wasn't as many variations that stood out. And then what the other things that changed, job stress was actually slightly lower than the comparison, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then also self-efficacy. Now, we had 2 scales of self-efficacy. These are when a teacher does not feel that they have the skills needed to be successful in the profession. It's one of the biggest predictors of leaving rates, even more than the intent to quit scale sometimes. So the intent has that strong correlation as well. But those measures were actually very similar, and in a large part, a little bit higher than we might have expected. Like teachers felt, in some sense, a capacity within that area. Some of these, like, how much can you motivate? How much can you get to believe that they will do well in school? How much do you help students value learning? We saw some similar numbers, and in fact, a little bit higher than the comparison rates. So there's some feeling of capacity despite all the challenges that are happening, despite the feeling that they might need, I've considered leaving the profession. They're still, I would say, putting in so much work to still try to be successful. And that was, they're seeing some of the the confidence in that area, even though it is stressful, there's consideration of it. So some comparability. It's not a one narrative story. There's some variation within it. And I would say what y'all are doing is a little bit more groundbreaking. So, but it would be interesting to see how this compares as other pieces are coming out, and hopefully other places are starting to use some of the survey work that we've created here too. So,
thank you, members. Are there additional questions? Seeing none, I'll turn it back over to you, President Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth, and thank you, Ryan and Keely. We appreciate the work that you put into this survey project, and look forward to passing along any additional questions we may have. But thank you for joining us tonight.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night, everybody.
You too. Members, we are now turning to committee reports. I am excited to say that our newly established standing committees have already started to meet. And tonight we are going to hear, among the reports that we're going to hear and review are include those standing committees. But first, we're going to start with our Student Advisory Committee. And so Student Representatives O'Sullivan and Dale, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, President Parker. We don't really have any new updates. We're supposed to have our next Student Advisory Committee meeting on Monday, where we are going to discuss changes to the student representative position and then make recommendations by the next public meeting. And besides that, I think we are also going to plan in the meeting the future tasks we'll do until June. And I definitely had some ideas in mind in terms of maybe something of like reaching out to students, particularly on the aspect of mental health, and also just seeing what we can do in terms of gauging where students are at right now. But we'll see. And I think there are a bunch of possibilities, but we'll have to ask the committee about what we think the right next steps are.
Thank you. Excited to see what you all come up with. Next, Advocacy and Outreach, Representative Reed.
Hi, so we have set a meeting date, which is going to be the third Friday of every month following our public meeting. It'll be a good opportunity to kind of see if there are any areas that we should rally behind or advocate around or follow up on. So yep, third Friday of each month at 10 o'clock a.m. The first one being March 19th at 10 a.m. The April meeting will be on April 9th because April 16th is Emancipation Day in DC. The joint oversight letter has been drafted. I received feedback from Representative Sutter, Gazoy, and Wattenberg, and I formatted, I think I gave everyone a really rough draft. Alex has formatted it. There's some questions, but I just want to make sure, does anybody want to have any thoughts, want to weigh in before we're trying to wrap it up by Friday? That was an open question to people.
Representative Reed, I would recommend let's handle that offline, and members can respond whether or not they feel comfortable signing, and that will let us know how we will proceed, whether it comes from the board or from certain members.
Okay, and then in the offline, if people can, I think I'm just gonna pull out the questions from Alex that are worth probably everyone hearing. Further defining well-rounded education, budget decreases, and citations I can handle. But I'll put that out to everyone just to kind of think about when you're submitting feedback. So that's really it. I'm not sure, is it questions or? All right.
Thank you for your work. I believe you will get many more comments, including from me. So thank you. Next, we have our Assessment and Accountability Committee, Representatives Wattenberg and Patterson.
I see Mr. Patterson is not speaking, so I will speak. So we have set a permanent date. We have not met. Actually,
we did meet. We did actually.
No, our committee hasn't met. Yes, let me say that. Representative Patterson and I have met. The committee as a whole has not met. We had a great meeting, by the way. We're going to have a great committee. We have set the third Thursday from 4:30 to 6:30 as our permanent time. So sort of like what Representative Reed was saying about her group, we'll be meeting right after the public meeting. And we had thought we were going to have our first meeting. We don't want to wait until then to have our first meeting. We thought we were going to have one this Monday, but I think we now have some conflicts. So stay tuned, and we'll meet, and you'll know what we did at some point soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything to add?
Oh, you summed that up very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is the Education Standards Committee, and Representative Sutter already shared a report. So I would ask that you reference that as she shares.
Yeah, thank you, President Parker. So we had a great meeting of our Education Standards Committee last Wednesday, and we're going to host our meetings on the fourth Wednesday of every month. It started out with a discussion of the charge of our committee, as is outlined in the report. We came up with some great ideas about topics that are of interest to members that we might put under that charge. And we're developing a work plan that we'll have ready. We'll probably come back to it at our next meeting on the 24th of March and have it ready to share at the April working session. I believe that's when we're supposed to bring it back for the full board to discuss. We came up with a couple of ideas about public meeting topics, including a panel on homeschooling. We discussed that there seems to be an increase in the interest in that method of schooling born out of the pandemic. We wanted to hear more about that since the state board does have authority over homeschooling guidelines, guidance, as it were. And then we talked a little bit about the ongoing work of the social studies and where that is. I think worth for the good of the order and in the notes as well, the OSCE Technical Writing Committee met on Monday. And because I know this was a question for a lot of the senior members of the board who were part of the process last year, the Technical Writing Committee wants to make an iterative process in which they bring questions to the SISAC and then iterate on them and then bring back a draft and then get back to the SISAC on it. So that collaboration and ongoing iteration that you all had hoped for from OSCE seems to have been borne out. So we're going to get that, which is great. I don't have anything else that I think is necessary to share at this point, but if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
It is great to hear. I know the Social Studies Advisory Committee met yesterday.
They did.
Any headlines out of that conversation?
Sure. It was a great meeting. We basically talked a little bit about the OSCE Technical Writing Committee and then broke into small groups to ask how members of the SISAC best thought we could proactively engage with the writing committee, as well as what we could tell the writing committee they could count on us for. And then we ended with a discussion of basically how to keep each other up to date on what's happening in the district on social studies, as well as around the country on social studies, and how we continue to build a DC social studies community. So I think one of our next steps is this idea of crowdsourcing from the SISAC. What groups are they already part of? What groups already exist that are part of the DC social studies ecosystem, so that we can start to do some like network mapping of who's involved in those and how do we leverage those for the work of the writing committee and for the work of rolling out the standards going forward. I have to tell you, I'm so excited by the fact that the folks on the SISAC who were only expected to meet quarterly this year, we're like, no, if we need to talk more often, we're in. If you want to engage in between meetings, like let us know how we engage. So it's exciting that our work is providing this additional forum for educators to stay engaged with their colleagues across the city.
Thank you for that. And members, I would encourage you to check out the names on that Social Studies Technical Writing Committee. That's a very impressive group and OSCE released that list of names this week. And so we'll be sure to circulate them again if you have not already seen it. But thank you, Representative Sutter.
Yeah, I thought Ruth might have a question. Representative Wattenberg, do you have a question?
I do, thanks. Just in terms of the iterative process, will there also be opportunities during that to start putting this out to the broader public? So I think that will be important before we get to a final document.
Yeah, there's definitely public engagement envisioned, but the group met for the first time on Monday. So I imagine that we're looking at probably public engagement closer to August.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Okay.
Representative O'Leary, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you, Representative Sutter. Next up is Representative O'Leary to share out.
I have a statement.
The Educator Practice Committee.
I'm going to read the statement and then I'll have a couple of things to say. This statement was given to me by Caitlin, who is the boss of the Educator Practice Committee now. In addition to the progress with the All Teacher Survey, Alex and Darren presented the State Board's 2020 Teacher Retention Survey report at a national conference held by EC DataWorks last month. In addition to sharing the findings and the methodology of the report, they were able to share how the State Board has been working on gathering and analyzing workforce data, which was of interest to early childhood education policymakers and researchers. Overall, it was a great opportunity to share the State Board's work on a national scale. And we're going to be meeting for the first time tomorrow. And we have we're going to be presenting at a conference in April. I'll let you know more about that at our next business meeting, because the conference is right after our next business meeting. That's what I got. The Teacher Retention Survey is going to be a pusher for finding out what we're going to find out about teacher retention. We still don't have the numbers from 2020 to compare with 2019 and 2018. Judging from this teacher survey, the numbers might be interesting, to say the least. We have no idea what's going to happen after this school year is over as far as teacher retention.
That is concerning, to say the least. But thank you, Representative O'Leary, for that update. Next, Vice President Gasoy with an update from the Administrative Committee.
Yes, thank you. So at our first admin committee meeting, we mainly focused on budgets, and we mainly focused on the budgets of our sister agencies, and specifically just asking them where they are and what they would wish for if they could have more support. And so they both really, they expressed a great need for more staff. And especially in this time going into the next school year, when there's, we can anticipate much greater need and, more reach out. And so we have decided to address that in our oversight. I think we're waiting to hear actually back from Serena on whether she wants that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, President Parker, but in any case, we discussed that, and it's something that's definitely on our radar. We also talked about something that I am learning about is the FOIA process from the inside. And so there have been some FOIA requests. And so we're just talking, had some updates from John Paul about that. I don't think there's much to share about that, or that I can share about that, but it's just interesting to know we do get them. And then we started to talk about social media policy and whether or not we should update the one that we have. And so that's to be continued. And so we're going to take that up again at our next meeting, which is next week. Yes. I think that's it.
Thank you. Representative Reed, I know, so thank you for those who shared out about our standing committees. We also have 2 ad hoc committees / task forces. It is my understanding that neither have formally met, but Representative Thompson, did you want to give an update about where we are with the board governance ad hoc committee?
No, we have not formally met. I look forward to sharing an update when we do formally meet. And we have started thinking about what are some of the things we like to place into our work plan. So I anticipate that we'll be ready to share that at when it's due. Sorry, it's now 7:38, and I think I shut down around 6:45.
I totally understand. Thank you. For the task force, an email is coming to members, by the way, but we are slated to meet this Monday. It seems like that is the time that works for everyone. We will be focused on 3 questions. What are going to be the questions that task force aims to answer? What are the problems we're working to address is another way of putting it, as well as what is our process in terms of timeline? When will we advertise an application for external members? When will we meet? When will we deliver a report formally? As well as what is the role and function of our ombudsman? Serena Hayes is interested in teaming up with that task force. We're really excited about that, but we need to figure out what that looks like. So those are going to be the areas in which we focus on Monday when we convene. So on behalf of Alistair and myself, I look forward to sharing more when we can. And so,
what time is that one? Sorry.
Say it again.
What time is that one?
We will send the email soon.
Okay.
That concludes our committee updates. We are now to the new business portion of our meeting. There is one item that I wanted to introduce. Are there other items that members wanted to introduce? Representative Wattenberg.
I just wanted to say I sent around to folks a letter around the vaccination. President Parker had a comment on, I think is going to sort of provide a paragraph or some sentences to go in it. And let me know either if you're interested in being part of it, if you're not interested in being part of it, and if you have edits to it. So it's sort of both things. Maybe it could be a perfect letter and for whatever reason, it's not something you want to be part of. I want to know that. And if you want to be part of it, but there's something you want to see fixed or altered or changed, whatever, I want to know that too. But we do want to move it sort of quickly. It came up today, and if we're going to get this done, the dates are really close. I mean, it has to happen now. So that's all I want to say. I don't know if, yeah.
Do others want to make a comment regarding the letter or just the matter of vaccination in general? Representative Sutter?
Yeah, I just want to ask a clarifying question. What I still don't understand is whether it was a problem with the portal last week that teachers were not able to register, or if it is policy that teachers are not able to register for vaccine, because it says that teachers can register. And I think that might be something we want to get an answer on before we send the letter. The second thing is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is now approved, and the president made comments that he wants to see every teacher get at least 1 shot by the end of March. And given that a large portion of the next set of vaccinations is going to be Johnson & Johnson, that's another thing I'd want us to investigate before I'd feel comfortable signing on to a letter calling for some change, because the Johnson & Johnson is a 1-shot vaccine, which would alter the timeline a little bit. So those are my questions on the vaccine letter that I'd want us to get clarity on before I think about signing on.
I see your hand, Representative Wattenberg. Are there other questions, comments? Representative Thompson, and then Representative Wattenberg, I'm gonna give you the last word so you can respond to folks.
Thank you. I'm going to state my understanding, which could be completely incorrect. I think, as I understand it, teachers who have an in-person assignment can register. One of the things that seems unclear to me is when in-person assignments for term 4 will be solidified. And so we didn't have I had it on my list of things that I would like to ask the chancellor, but we only had 3 minutes. And so I think part of the problem is that actually not too dissimilar from what we're experiencing with the OSCE letter, is the language states teachers returning can get vaccines. The hurdle seems to be them actually having assignments. Because from what I can tell, and I could be wrong, Dcps, I can only speak for Dcps, has not made a decision about encouraging more teachers to go back in person, or at least said, and it's going to be 10 teachers, 20 teachers, 100 and whatever many teachers. That seems to be the problem. I don't know what or when charters make those individual decisions. But if you don't actually have an assignment yet, they will not let you register. Even if you are saying, I'm probably going to volunteer, I would like to go if I have a vaccine, which is what I think people are saying, like, I would go if I could get vaccinated.
We will follow up with the Chancellor's office to get answers to remaining questions, and we'll be sure to add that to our list. I think that is a very important question. Are there other comments, questions?
Just the only, wait, am I on?
I was hoping to get to everybody so you could have the last word, but I'm not seeing any other requests for comment. Oh, Representative or Vice President Gasor.
Yeah, I mean, just adding to what Representative Thompson just said, that is my understanding as well. And I could be wrong about this next thing I'm going to say, but I think what I have understood from principals is that, like, that decision can be made at the school level at this point. If, you know, principals want, if principals and teachers decide that that's what they want, then that can happen. That teacher then, I think the principal can sign something. I don't know the process, but apparently there is a process. So that's something to ask as well, to verify.
Any other comments? All right, it's yours, Representative Wattenberg. And you're muted.
You almost made it through the meeting.
I think the problem is it's very mushy. And in fact, when the chancellor was here, he was very mushy. And there was nothing in what he said that said, yes, we agree teachers who are going to go back to in-person work should get vaccinated and they should get 2 vaccinations before they go back. Very clearly, that's not what the message was.
And a point of information, I hate to interrupt you. I think the Chancellor has been clear there that while they want educators to be vaccinated, they do not see that as a requirement for educators going back in person.
Exactly. I mean, he said exactly. He said it in a lot of different ways.
I just don't think it's fair to say that they've been mushy, because I think they've been clear that they just don't agree that educators must be vaccinated first. So just point of information.
Well, I mean, just to go back to Jessica, I mean, Jessica is saying it was her, and I think Ebony Rose was saying as well, there is also an understanding out there that teachers who are going back to work can get the vaccination. So that's what I mean about the mushiness. There's an official position. There's what everybody thinks is going on. There's a reality of what's going on the site, which is that last week, teachers who were planning to go back could not get on. As I understand, I have a lot of evidence of that. And this week, they're not allowed to go on. So by mushy, I mean, there's not a clear statement that says teachers who want to go back, who plan to go back, should get vaccinations and they should have 2 by the date necessary. So that's one thing. And I think if we let mushiness, I'll just use that word, whatever, lack of clarity, deter us from saying something, we will have very few situations where we can say things, because often, whether deliberately or not, things aren't totally clear. So I think we should not let that deter us. And I'm also afraid my battery is going to go out. And the second thing, in terms of what Representative Sutter raised about the Johnson & Johnson, and then what are you saying that then it could go a lot later if we were to get them? I mean, I think that's reasonable, and that can be part of it, to sort of say, then it could be a later date. So I would be totally for putting that in there. And guys, I'm just going to go get my battery. I'm sorry. If people want to say more, wait till I get my battery and we can come back. Hold on.
Thank you, Representative. I think we've exhausted this topic, and members, I would encourage you to weigh in via email. Representative Weidenberg would greatly appreciate your feedback. Student Representative O'Sullivan, did you have a comment regarding the letter?
Yeah, well, it wasn't regarding this topic, but I already said it in the chat, but I was kind of concerned because last summer I kind of noticed how the entire debate was about school reopening, and then like no questions got answered about recommendations for improving virtual learning. So like we made a report at the end of last school year, and then like with a bunch of problems or recommendations for change, and the same problems showed up beginning this school year. So like, I don't know, I was just hoping the board could try to put an emphasis on like, whether it's a backup plan or not, they need to take it seriously about the possibility of virtual learning happening again, and also like trying to improve it. Because like I said earlier, I mean, if we get 3 opportunities to do it and we fail all 3 times, then like that's pretty bad. And I think if we're going to get a 3rd shot at it, we should probably do it right. So just for that reason, I just hope this summer there is like a strong emphasis on how can we improve virtual learning if there is some sort of hybrid learning model.
Understood. Representative O'Leary?
Re-emphasize what Alex is talking about. The chancellor was talking about that. I mean, it sounded to me like that they're going full force into being all in person in August. And I don't know what world that is in. I hope that that's true, but not to have because the backup plan that they had this year, because it didn't really work that well for a lot of people. And I think that we need to, I mean, I know the council's working on their own plan, and it needs to be, and we don't set up plans, but we sure can raise our voices about getting something that's going to work, because a lot of it's not working at all right now.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move us to our next topic. And I believe we could be brief here. We know that the Mayor Bowser, will be on the Hill to testify in support of DC statehood. I believe it's a topic that the board should take a more prominent stance around. I will defer to the natives on the board, but generally, I wanted to get a sense of how you all felt in terms of drafting a letter advocating for DC statehood, putting forth the arguments, educational arguments for statehood. And so my sense is everyone is going to be in favor of that, but I didn't want to assume that. And if we are in favor of it, my recommendation would be for the natives on the call. I'm looking at you, Representative Thompson, Reed, our student representatives, and others, I believe that may have covered it, to take a lead in drafting that letter for the board, which I think would be a very important stance for us to make. Thoughts, reactions? Great, everyone loves the idea.
I like the idea.
Awesome, awesome.
But I am not a native.
Awesome. Representative Thompson, I'm not sure if you have your hand raised or. It's hard to see now that you've changed the color. But Representative Thompson.
I did not change the color. I had my hand raised from previously, and I didn't put it down.
You know what is happening? Your hand is.
I figured it out. I put the whole breakdown of what's happening in the chat. So, so at this point, it's dark.
Visually, your hand is where your picture and your background is, which I think makes it hard to see the hand. But sorry about that.
Yeah, but you know, brown hand, whatever. I did not have my hand raised for this. I do think that like statehood is important. It's clearly received an elevated possibility recently. I don't know if I've thought too much about what some of the questions people will have from an education perspective. Like I remember being an ANC commissioner when Bowser was making her rounds in her first term around statehood, and people had some questions around things like the scholarships that we receive and being able to attend in person. I've also gotten some questions recently around the conversation with board authority and statehood, and some people suggesting that one impacts the other, which it doesn't, because our current structure is actually something that we decided on. So I was hesitant to say anything because I'm someone who likes to have a better understanding of like what it means for my lane. So why I totally think DC should be the 51st state. I bought the t-shirt, all of that stuff. I don't know if I've given much thought to what it means for the board to weigh into this and some of the questions that we'll get, whether they're real or imagined.
Understood.
So.
No, thank you for that. Representative O'Leary, do you have your hand raised for this?
I didn't, but I was going to, because I think that this is one of those topics that I don't quite understand what I mean, I think we're all for representation and everything like that, but I don't know what it does. I don't know how it's going to change anybody's mind. We have many more important topics to advocate for than statehood, to be honest with you. And I've got the sign in my front yard. I'm all for it, but I don't know what having a letter saying that we're for statehood is gonna. It's like saying we're for education.
I don't know if it should be assumed. Not to belabor the point, in my opinion and assessment, there are very clear arguments to be made from an education perspective of the downfall of DC not being a state. In part, what we talked about tonight in terms of federal funds allocated to DC because we're not a state. We also know how education policy works locally versus federally, but also for the futures of the young people in this city. And I don't need to lecture you all. I know you all get all of that. All that to say that I think as city officials are rallying behind the cause of DC statehood, I would want the State Board of Education to be part of that conversation. And we haven't historically. So that was more the thought. Representative Thompson.
Yes, okay, I raised my actual hand. So I do think, I do think, I don't ever want to assume. I do think most people think there are good things about statehood. I'm not arguing against it. I am though saying, because I heard you say you wanted to make the suggestions that the natives draft this. And as someone who was super unapologetic about being a DC native, I knew that meant me being one of those people. And I'm saying, like, for me to feel comfortable drafting something, given that like people have raised questions to me about that in particular, I would want to be able to answer every question. You know, like I don't want to just ceremonially go on the record and say like, yes, it's a good thing. I want us as the state board, both to like champion the cause, but also do some real education around, because like I'll say as a native, statehood has not been something that is super urgent or sexy for a long time. There are a million other things that we've been concerned with and kind of consumed with. And yes, there are real implications for us. And I know them and I understand them. But I also think it's important to not be paternalistic in saying like, this is good and it's good for you and you should just come along. Because I know a lot of my, friends, neighbors, people who I've grown up with, family members, don't understand why this is important right now. And I think that we should always take the opportunity to educate. And so that's what was happening in my head when I had my delayed lowered hand and I was called on. So I don't want to dismiss the idea, but I do want to be able to educate and say what it means for education in particular.
Understood, and I would agree. And I'm going to suggest we table this for now, move forward with it, but starting with that education. As we were talking about it, and I was hearing you, Representative Thompson, and I hear and agree with a lot of what you shared, the thought was in the back of my mind, like, this is public conversation. I would hate for someone's pushback would be to use some of this dialogue as reason not to move forward. We could talk more about that. Representative Sutter, before we move off of this topic, did you want to, oh, this is for something else. Do you want to go ahead and introduce a new topic?
Yes, so it's my understanding that now we're bringing up ceremonial resolutions at our working sessions as well, is that right?
No, we are suggesting ceremonial resolutions that will be taken up at the public meeting.
Right, that's what I meant, like, but we're supposed to raise the issue now?
Yes, yes.
Great. I just wanted to make sure that someone suggested that for March we do Women's History Month / International Day of the Woman as one of our ceremonial resolutions. I had a great conversation, thanks to Representative O'Leary, with a woman from the Women's National Democratic Committee about a very cool calendar they've created of Black women in history for Women's History Month, and it got me thinking about that. Yeah, mine's on its way. I'm super excited. We're helping get it out to the high schools. So yeah, would love to make sure that we include a ceremonial resolution for that at our March public meeting.
Yes, that was already on our list, but that is great.
Awesome.
And maybe you can help introduce it when the time comes.
We'd be happy to.
I'm sure you all would be happy to know there's also a ceremonial resolution about music in schools. And so as a former band geek, or maybe I shouldn't use that language, I'm excited about that ceremonial resolution. Representative Thompson.
I cannot play any instruments, but I think music in schools is valuable. I would like to suggest we do a ceremonial resolution, I guess recognizing Nannie Helen Burroughs in particular. She's someone who has a legacy in Ward 7. She is an educator and a Black woman, and someone who, since we're talking about statehood, helped expand, fought to expand suffrage to people who look like me in particular. So since this is the time to suggest ceremonial resolutions, I like to add that one to our radar.
And members, you don't have to just introduce it or talk about it here, but you certainly can. And I love that you are elevating her, Representative Thompson. I would empower all members to continue to highlight those groups, organizations, as well as individuals in your respective wards that have been beneficial and instrumental to improving outcomes for our students. So, are there others? Awesome. Not to put you all on the spot, but I know Representatives Patterson, Reed, Thompson had an event last night that was pretty innovative, where you were taking the state board to the streets. And I want to give you an opportunity before we close this meeting to just elevate any headlines from the conversations that you had last night.
I just have to say that it was Representative Thompson's idea. She did the initial outreach to Representative Patterson and I, indicating that she felt like we were all saying the same thing, but needed a collective vehicle for executing it. So I have to give her public comment or shout out for that. The question was about what? We had about 11 people to actually testify. Similar format to three minutes. We were a little forgiving because, you know, we do things different in our own special way. About 11 people testified, and then a few people who were still on in the audience, I guess, watching. And then we had some people who were on social media, and a variety of testimony from a variety of topics. I will say, and I'll let the both other representatives chime in, but probably one of the comments that stuck out most to me was a mom who I think she came from out of the Facebook. Somebody must have shared the link with her. And she was talking about the process for finding a school. And I asked her what on the report card, you know, was helpful in making her decision. And she said, I never even looked at that site. And that was amazing for me. Because it shows that, you know, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, what goes into my school DC and all that stuff. But it was just interesting about how people are making choices, and, you know, our considerations for whenever we do look at that report card again. We invited her to hopefully join a working group or something, because she has fresh eyes, as Representative Thompson said.
And while I would imagine she's not looking at our report card, there are metrics that are still very much important to her and others that they are looking at that make a decision. So thank you for sharing that. Representative Thompson, Patterson.
I just wanted to add, President Parker, is that what I saw was so relevant about last night, because it was unprecedented in the sense of east of the river representatives forming a caucus, was that what it meant to the people who live east of the river. I got a lot of feedback from individuals who live both in east of the river and those who watch the happenings of east of the river. And to see 3 representatives that said, look, we're going to work on things that really affect the residents who have been impacted the most historically, financially, in budgeting things. It said a lot to them, and they said they're happy to see it, including our former vice president this morning. Mr. Batchelor reached out to us to compliment us on that. He said, I'm really proud of what you guys did and how you guys went about doing that and answering it. So, you know, we weren't trying to exclude anybody, but we just wanted to make sure that we put a focus on, you know, a group of students that have historically been underfunded, underserved, and let everyone know that, you know, as a group that lives east of the river, that we're going to advocate for them in a very aggressive way. So I'm very proud to be part of this. I think it was wonderful. Representative Thompson, I really appreciate how everything came along. Representative Reed, how you took everything in. And I would just say that we need to do these type of things in the future, just to let people know that we hear them, that we represent them, and we want to elevate their voices, because we want more people to be involved in the State Board of Education. And this is a group that has felt they really didn't get a lot of representative in the past from the State Board. So it was a good event.
Absolutely. Representative Thompson.
I mean, I would just want to say first, thank you to both of my colleagues who totally could have told me no, because then it just would have been a great idea and there would have been no event. Execution matters. I think that one of the reasons I asked was because we have a bunch of conversations and we ask about equity, and then we insert east of the river, and we say we need to center voices, and the truth of the matter is all of that gets very muddy really quickly. And the easiest way to unmuddy it is just to give people their own space. in a space where they feel comfortable. And so that's really our why over anything else. As I shared yesterday when we opened it up, like our title is representative, but it really is also like our job description, like it's our mandate. We're supposed to be representative, and I don't know how you could claim to start to be that if you're not in conversation with people. So I appreciate like just being able to try this. I appreciate the partners who we had who put the word out and said like, hey, like this is an opportunity. And I really look forward to kind of our next steps because I know you said we took it to the streets, but you know, we took it virtually, but we're actually going to go into some streets and create some opportunities to gather more feedback. And so we look forward to just kind of elevating, amplifying, and being true to what our community is saying is important to them. So I really appreciate all the work that went into this. I appreciate the willingness to try, and I appreciate everyone who is not east of the river in location, but did reach out and say like, how can we be supportive? Because to me, that's actually putting our voices at the center.
Absolutely. Thank you. Vice President Gasoy, did you have a comment?
Sure. I had a question and then just a reminder. So I was just wondering if you are planning to share that like written report out on that. No pressure, but I'm just wondering, I mean, I think it's a good idea for all of us to do this more and also to maybe just share highlights. I mean, obviously we don't need notes from the whole meeting, but especially if, after over time we start noticing patterns. So it's just something I guess I'm more putting out there than asking, but if you want to respond.
I am notoriously bad at taking notes. I'm just going to be upfront with that, which is why, at least in the Education Council, I have a wonderful secretary. That being said, we did record the meeting.
Okay.
We together did our best to take some notes, but we also have it kind of baked into our next steps to really like capture more notes, and we will lift up something at the end of our process. We are keeping in mind the oversight and budget schedule. So this is not like a super, like we do have a real deadline, and we want to be able to incorporate a lot of what trends and bright spots and all the things that people said in our testimonies to the council in particular. So we are happy to share that with the group.
I think
Dr. Carlene, did I miss? I'm sorry, Representative.
I think no, you're on. Like we're definitely, I think, interested in also incorporating the voices that we want to get from being in the streets, because we know that we want to acknowledge not everybody's going to log into a Zoom, so we want to catch folks and make sure we balance all that on the equal plane.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Can I just also make a plug since Representative Chang isn't here? You all know that he is planning the April 14th read around the city. I don't know exactly what he's calling it, but the read. And so I'm reminding myself as well, we need to figure out the logistics for that in each of our wards. So just a reminder. Citywide story time. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you for
Representative.
And I'm fortunate enough that he's doing it in our ward, mine and Representative Reed's. And so I know I'm going to be attending. I've already reserved the time. So
yeah, Brenda Richardson. That's
as
great.
At large, remember, you have to make it across the city for that day, Jessica.
I'll do that.
No, he doesn't.
Representative O'Leary.
Yes, I would like to remind, thank you for Vice President Gasoy, because you want to talk to your board member, your council member, to try to get your council member to work with you when you're reading to the children on the 14th of April.
I think so. I mean,
No, I'm ordering everyone to talk to your council member.
Oh, you're saying
so that you can read with them on that day. And what was the other thing? Oh, how many board members are going to be testifying next week?
What's next week?
Next week is the budget hearing on the
The oversight hearing.
oversight hearing
Right.
on the 9th, right? It's the 9th, it's the 9th, I think.
The 9th.
It's
Yeah.
the 9th. It's the only one.
Yep. Okay, that was it. I just had a question.
Can I ask, have people gotten notifications that they were accepted, or is it unlimited, or is it limited? Do we know?
No, I have. If you apply, then you got to notice that you're going to be on it.
Oh, I didn't get that.
It's the Zoom, but I haven't seen the official list.
They won't.
Yeah,
give
that's
the
not
list
out yet.
Okay.
This won't come
Yeah.
out until
Because
Tuesday.
they'll put the panel together after they get the list, after they cut it off. So they need to see who all is going to do it after the cutoff. They'll put those panels together. So most of the state board people will probably be closely together.
That's what happened last time.
Has everybody else gotten a confirmation?
I had to do some advocacy last time, so that's why I'm looking for that list to get on it.
Okay, thank you. We are about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. President?
Yes.
I apologize, but did you have any items from the leadership report that you wanted to make?
I totally forgot about that. Thank you. Very quickly, and I will do this. I'll forward the written version of this. But in terms of the leadership report, Mendelssohn's Student Town Hall is upcoming. I will make sure you have the date so that you can advertise that within your wards. The state board, we have funds that we need to spend this year before September. Part of those funds will go towards professional development for staff. The remainder of those funds will be for research purposes. As you and your committees are working, we ask you to think about limited research that might be helpful as you're executing your work plan. And we will give more guidance about that. We've already discussed the upcoming performance oversight, and Vice President Gasoy and I are going to be doing one-on-ones with members, very informal, but to learn about how we can advance the interests of the board, but also expand our reach in your respective wards. In some respects, and in similar ways as the East of the River event we saw last night, taking the state board to the street. So those are the headlines from the leadership report. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
It has now been moved. Second?
Second.
All in favor of adjourning our meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Bye.
All opposed, please say nay. The ayes have it. It is now 8:15 p.m. and our meeting is adjourned. Thank you to members of the public and members. Thank you.
Bye.